I've cared about this topic for a long time. My oldest son is 15 now, and I remember being in the throes of early parenthood when he had raging colic and was screaming all the time. Things were really difficult. I made all these changes to my diet. I did all this stuff. And I definitely picked up a couple different probiotics along the way, hoping that they would magically give me some sleep and some rest and that my baby would feel better. Welcome to the Nutrition for the Early Years podcast with Dr. Liz, your guilt-free guidance for feeding your family. This podcast is for folks who are craving better nutrition for their kids, but are tired of the whiplash of nutrition claims and diet culture influence. You're reading labels, paying attention to ingredients, but you still doubt yourself, and for good reason. Food goes deep, and often we fear making costly mistakes that as parents we hope to prevent. If you're ready to explore the ins and outs of your child's actual nutrition needs and nourish the whole child from the inside out, hang with me, Dr. Liz Daniels. I'm a board-certified pediatrician plus registered dietitian, and we're going to dig deep into real-deal nutrition science, honest talk about barriers to health, and real stories that I help address. So let's dig in. Hey guys, thanks so much for joining the Nutrition for the Early Years podcast with Dr. Liz. I'm excited today because there is a lot to talk about. Now, before I go any further, you're like, wait a minute, I thought this was the Lunchbox Reformation. And it was. I love the title, and I'm going to have to save it for my first book maybe, but I needed to shift. It's just a little obscure, so I get it. But that said, I'm really pumped to talk about probiotics today. Before we dive in, if this podcast has been helpful for you so far, it would mean a lot to me if you would subscribe and leave a quick rating or review. That is actually how families are able to find this content, and I would super appreciate that support because that's what this is all about, is helping parents get the right kind of information that they feel good about. Today, we're talking about probiotics in infancy. This is a topic I get asked about all the time, and it's one that's really unique to the very early days of life. In fact, it's a really different conversation than probiotics for older kids. And it's actually quite nuanced. The good news is that we do have more literature now than we used to, but there's still a bunch of hype. There's a ton of products and still a lot of confusion. What I want to do today is walk you through the same kind of conversation that I have with families in my office, the questions that they ask me, what's actually going on physiologically in the baby's gut. We're going to talk about what the literature really says, where the gaps in the literature still are, and how to decide whether this is something that you might want to try with your baby or not. So really, what we live in right now is what I kind of call the gray, where there's research being done. We have some solid evidence. There's claims that are being made that maybe are unsubstantiated. And then there's a lot of opinions and a lot of products. When you really ask the experts, like the ones who are truly doing this literature, who live it, breathe it, and teach it, there's still some uncertainty. And that disconnect is frustrating. As a parent, as a consumer, and I get it, but it's also still really fascinating when you think about it because that disconnect is frustrating. But it's also fascinating, and it's why I like helping families walk through this thoughtfully instead of reactively. I've cared about this topic for a long time. My oldest son is 15 now, and I remember being in the throes of early parenthood when he had raging colic and was screaming all the time. Things were really difficult. I made all these changes to my diet. I did all this stuff, and I definitely picked up a couple different probiotics along the way, hoping that they would magically give me some sleep and some rest and that my baby would feel better. But you know what? I didn't really see a big difference. And it left me feeling confused because I had really hoped there would be something there. Not confused because I thought that it would really be magic, but confused because I still felt like I didn't know what to do with my kid. And so I want to speak to that a little bit today. So with that curiosity stuck with me. And I want to help translate what we know now into something that's practical for you, because you are not the only parent who is curious. So in clinic, the questions that usually come up for me with families are, when the similar kind of scenario, when they're in the fog of being in the sleepless days of the early month of life, around 2 weeks to a month old, parents are starting to notice some patterns. They may be noticing stool changes. They may be noticing that their baby's having more gas or fussiness or irritability. Sometimes it's that they're were pooping really frequently and now all of a sudden they aren't. Or sometimes it's because parents, had wanted to breastfeed or were trying to breastfeed and then they aren't, and they're looking at their formula and wondering if it needs to be something that's supplemented. Or sometimes I'll hear, gosh, if it'll help their immune system, then I really want to do it. And baby's born in the fall or something like that. So some of the questions specifically that I'll get are, my baby seems to be so gassy and uncomfortable. Should I be using a probiotic? Would this help with their digestion? Will it help with their pooping? And if you had asked me in the throes of my own son, I would have been somewhat ambivalent, because I remember some days feeling like, yeah, I think this is really helping. And other days feeling like, no, it's doing nothing. And that back and forth was really confusing. And I understand. And part of the thing here that we have to remember is that our interpretation of what our baby is doing is not always very clear. Like, babies are going to cry because that's their primary form of communication. And even though we think we maybe understand if they're in pain or they're having a lot of discomfort, it might not be the reality. A lot of the times it's just immaturity. And I can say this now, having a lot more time to be able to reflect back on and use that. So it's hard. So give yourself grace if you're in the middle of it all and you're struggling to interpret what your baby really needs. Okay. Now I want to think a little bit more about what's actually going on in the first month of life. Let's talk about, why is this even an important conversation? Because it is. So in the first month of life, babies have very immature immune systems, but they also rapidly mature in that first couple of months. So it's really, really amazing. Their small intestine is also still developing digestive enzymes, learning how to develop motility and absorption. In other words, the gut wasn't really working. It was growing, but remember that the nutrition was going through the umbilical cord straight into their bloodstream, going to the liver, going to, all of the places in the body it needed to go. So they got to bypass most of the gut. The gut hasn't been used yet. And so sometimes we forget that, these things are having to get started. Now, when you put food into the gut, that does a couple of things. Overall, the nutrition that they're getting is not only helping to absorb and to be digested and broken down, but it's also helping the gut to grow, and it's teaching the gut a lot of things. So all of the nutrition, especially the carbohydrates, they'll go through the small intestine relatively intact and end up in the large intestine because the digestive enzymes haven't fully been delivered yet or produced. And this is especially true for something called human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs. These are complex carbohydrates that are in breast milk, and I think of them like fiber for breast milk. They don't get digested in the small intestine. They travel all the way down to the colon, where the gut bacteria that are there, the probiotics, break them down. That process produces gas, short-chain fatty acids, and some immune signaling compounds. And this is a beautiful ecosystem when it's balanced. Sometimes I like to think of this like a seesaw where, and this is simplified, but think of it kind of like this, where you have bacteria, the probiotics, and they need the food, the prebiotics. And you need them in balance. If you have all HMOs and not enough of the bacteria, then you have a lot of gas and bloating and discomfort. If you have all the bacteria and not enough of the HMOs, then potentially you're not keeping that gut flora very diverse and healthy. So they need each other, in other words. But back to the point here. HMOs are prebiotics. They're that food for the gut bacteria. And in breastfed babies, there's a large amount and a lot of different types of HMOs early on, and that helps to establish gut bacteria. As the milk matures, so we call breast milk mature when it's a month old, but as the milk matures through the first couple of months of life, a lot of the HMO levels will actually decrease while the microbiome continues to mature and diversify. Around about 1 month of life, we'll start to see changes in the gut motility, how things move. And that timing overlaps when many parents are noticing a lot of fussiness and stool changes. And I can't tell you that those things are directly causal, but the timeline matters. Hold up. But I will be talking about this in a future episode, all about newborn poop. So, if you're curious, just to say, subscribe, follow, so you don't miss out. Okay. So all that to say, should we actually add probiotics? This is where the literature's still a little underwhelming, even 15 years later. So what I mean here is that in full-term infants, probiotics haven't consistently shown long-term benefits for things like immune health, cognition, allergy prevention, overall development. And this is especially true for breastfed babies because breast milk actually provides both bacteria and prebiotics. My short answer is if your baby is full-term and you are breastfeeding exclusively, I don't think you're going to see much change with the additional probiotics. And that is now my 15 years after my son was born and lots of training later, why I look back and reflect and think adding probiotics probably didn't change the dial for me in that scenario because I was exclusively breastfeeding him. He was already getting all of that stuff anyway. So I was like, not quite peeing in the ocean, but I mean, I kind of liken it to that. I was already doing those things. My baby just had trouble. Okay. But I also would tell you that in my years of clinical experience, I actually have some families that come back and are like, holy cow, this probiotic is amazing. And so I have to listen to that. And then that is what prompts me to say, okay, so tell me more. What did you notice? Well, sometimes that's nuanced. And sometimes that's because they are on formula. And in formula, there's a little bit more caveat to this. Some formulas contain prebiotics, like HMOs, and some contain probiotics, like some lactobacillus strains. And some contain both, but they're not the same. Like what I mean here is that one product will have 5 HMOs or 2 HMOs, and they're different sources. Some formulas will have 2 different strains of fermented culture that provides probiotic, but none of the prebiotics. And sometimes you'll have one probiotic and one partially prebiotic, meaning each formula product that's on the market is a little different in some particular way. And so when we look at different formula products, it's important to understand the differences if your baby really responds differently to them. And this is really where your pediatrician should be able to help you guide through that because this is a whole world. And I love this world personally. It's like something I find incredibly fascinating. But this is part of the gray. This is why when I'm in my office, if a family's asking me this question, I'm going to dig into exactly what their baby's getting. I dig into a little bit of the mom's diet. I dig into what probiotics they're curious and really what symptoms they're trying to address. Because actually, when we look deeper into the literature, some of the strains that have been specifically studied are what I would maybe point to. In other words, I'm making an individualized plan for that baby and that mama and dad in front of me, and I'm trying to support them. Which is why I want to bring you this information because the blanket claims I feel like are not enough and I feel like you deserve better. Okay, so like if you're breastfeeding, probably not going to give you a whole lot of benefit. Okay, if you are on formula or you're combo feeding and you want to consider it because you're addressing specific symptoms, possibly reasonable. Talk to your pediatrician. And if you have a preterm infant, it might actually be super beneficial for you. I'm going to get into a couple of the caveats there in just a minute, but I think that's the main kind of takeaway here. So now I want to kind of add a little bit to this of, well, what would you get? Because not all strains are the same. So breast milk microbiota is actually very diverse, and it's going to include a lot of strains. Some like Staphylococcus, Streptococcus are some of the primary strains, along with Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium. Each of these families have a different additional strains within them. So just caveat, I'm not talking like MRSA or strep throat. These are not in your breast milk. I'm talking about specific strains. And for what it's worth, the lactobacillus and bifidobacterium tend to have a robust amount of literature that's growing. And these particular families have now been extensively kind of studied in terms of strain-specific interventions. And so the studies that are for infants tend to draw on these two primary families. And I think that's really interesting. So when you look at labels or you're looking at specific probiotics for infants, you're probably going to be seeing strains within the lactobacillus and the bifidobacterium families. For what it's worth, those are also a little bit easier to manufacture and produce. And so specifically bifidobacterium, those tend to be really, from a chemistry standpoint, easier. So that said, I think it's really important to know that the strains in particular have, like within lactobacillus and within bifidobacterium, it's tricky to narrow each of these down because the strain diversity is what in the global literature, like the bigger adult literature we see, is really beneficial for gut health. But to be really mechanistic to understand something, you have to reduce the number of variables in a study. And so it makes sense that companies are going to try to target a particular strain because they want something that has particular evidence behind it. And I fully understand that. But really, when we look at the clinical outcomes, we see so much improvement in breastfed babies compared to traditional formula-fed babies because there's diversity there. So it's really hard to see one particular strain do all the heavy lifting. It's something about this flora, this environment, this some kind of synergy that they all have together that's really, really clinically transformative. And that's why it's hard to see that clinical transformation in just a particular strain. So what are they claiming to do? I mean, a lot of the studies are actually claiming to reduce colic, amount of time crying, fussiness. Sometimes they are trying to look at clinical outcomes with things like allergy or sleep. And honestly, this is really tricky because there's so many other factors there. So when I have a family in front of me, what I typically encourage them to do is try to understand the patterns that they're noticing. If we're dealing with gas, one of the things that I often find families see a lot of improvement with is when they're watching the latch. If the latch is improper or there's bottle mechanics that are not going well, then what tends to happen is that babies end up swallowing a bunch of air, and that's called aerophagia. So the question a lot of the time that I'm trying to get to is this baby swallowing so much air that it's impacting their digestion, and you're seeing that crying and fussiness and irritability? When they cry and they're fussy and they're irritable, they take in more air, which just potentiates that difficulty. So I like to tease out if it's an air problem, aerophagia, or if it's really a digestion problem. And that takes a lot of conversation and some nuance there. So are you noticing that fussiness is tied to feeds or a particular time of day? Is it that stooling is the main issue? Is it that they feel so much relief when they pass gas? And so that's where I like to spend a lot of my time, is just trying to observe what the family is noticing and try to understand those patterns. The next thing I like to think about is, okay, if you find a pattern that is related to aerophagia, then we address that. We address the latch, or we address dealing with the gas. And then if it's not, and we really think it can be a digestion problem, then we look at that, right? Like, do we need to optimize this for a hydrolyzed protein product? Do we need to optimize something else that's going on in the actual nutrition that's coming in? And then if both of those buckets have been observed and addressed appropriately, then the third line thing for me to think about is, well, will a probiotic help? In other words, I like to go through things in a stepwise fashion because it helps me as a clinician really have confidence in both helping the family, but also learning from the baby that's in front of me, which means I'm not solving all the problems in one day or with one product. Sorry. But in my experience, that tends to be the most valuable in time, is really getting those patterns down. So I alluded to preterm infants a while ago. And what I want to mention here is that there's actually some pretty strong evidence for probiotics in preterm infants, so babies that are born under 37 weeks. And this is in the area of reducing the risk for necrotizing enterocolitis. And this is really cool. So over a decade ago when I was in training, this was not routinely being used because there was concern for gut permeability, meaning we were afraid that if we introduced probiotics into a very, very immature baby's gut, that they would not be able to, that they would actually get sick from the probiotics. And so this is an area of intense study because we do understand that the probiotics can serve sort of as a big part of signaling to the immune system. And so in numbers of different studies, big studies, well-done studies, they've actually determined that you can reduce the risk for necrotizing enterocolitis and overall mortality with the addition of some of these lactobacillus and bifidobacterium strains. That said, this is individually decided upon and under the care of your NICU team. So I'm not saying this as a global statement, but I'm saying this just as a window of how amazing the research has gone in the last decade. It's really helped us with the most vulnerable of the vulnerable babies. And I think that's really awesome. It gives me a lot of excitement and hope that this area of medicine will hopefully continue to grow and to deepen so that it can guide our understanding as babies mature. That said, I really like for families to then think about, okay, if my baby is a great candidate for probiotics and I'm on formula, where is the future? Where are we going? Well, my friend, I would like to tell you that I think the future probably is in somewhere, some shape of a blend of both pre and probiotics together. So I think that because we know that breast milk is obviously the gold standard, we want to find products that will reflect that. And so it's a natural thing to think, okay, pre plus probiotics are probably the direction we want to be going. And if you're in that camp and you're curious about products, it's something that's a really interesting area, but know that you're still in the gray, and that's okay. So if your baby is struggling and you want to try a probiotic, it's probably safe, but it's worth having a conversation with your pediatrician. Okay. So then the other area that's pretty interesting in terms of research and one that's being actively studied but still has some gaps in it are what is the relationship between gut flora and things like atopic disease, like eczema or food allergies or asthma risk. And this is super interesting because this is where there's some cool data. I don't tend to make it as a blanket statement that the addition of these things will dramatically reduce your risk. But in some of the studies so far, there has been some interesting literature about particularly Bifidobacterium longum strains and Bifidobacterium infantis that were associated with some lower risks of eczema in kids, as well as respiratory tract infections. I think that this is one where we have a lot of learning yet to do. Most of the time when I'm seeing kids who have eczema, I'm naturally going to be seeing that at about 2 months of life, starts to peak in that early infancy year and then kind of comes down. And I see that on kind of all my babies that are going to be prone to eczema, whether they're breastfed or bottle fed. So part of the reason that I hesitate with encouraging families to use probiotics in every situation is that I don't know what your risk is necessarily going to be. So it's hard for me to make a specific suggestion that's going to reduce that risk, meaning I don't know your genetics and I don't know your exact environment. So this is the gray that I mentioned. And this is where I like to say it's okay to try things out with supervision and guidance and have that conversation, because this is where we learn together. So just know that probiotics are really interesting, and I do think they are very important, whether they're coming in naturally through breast milk or if they're being supplemented. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have fewer allergies, better immune systems, fewer daycare illnesses, higher IQ scores or some type of cognitive improvement. Those claims really haven't been substantiated yet. And this is not a ubiquitous recommendation. But it's one that in thoughtful conversation with your healthcare team, it's reasonable to ask the question. It's reasonable to dig deeper. And I personally love it when my families want to go deeper. And I think it's a good place to be. It's okay to know that crying is just your form of communication. It's not always pain. Babies are going to give you clarity in time, not in a day. Slow down, get the support you need. If this left you with some more questions and you're curious, you want to reach out for more, go ahead and do that. Feel free to reach out to me on Instagram or at my website, newstorynutrition.com. Love to hear from you. Have a great day, guys, and enjoy your baby.